In the darkest part of a year, especially one as unsettled and uncertain as this has been, it's only natural to seek comfort in much-loved traditions, fine food and drink, the company of good friends, and stories. By joining us here today, you're with friends, and we certainly have some great stories for you. But I'm afraid you'll have to supply your own food and drink. Thank you for tuning in. Enjoy the show, and season's greetings to each and every one of you.
Hi, I'm Steve Rasnic Tem. If you want to know more about me or my work, please check out my website, www.stevetem.com. I'm going to read a Christmas story for you that I wrote a few years ago. It's been collected in my collection, Thanatron, from Valancourt Books. Whatever you want. The Christmas season was impossible to escape, gobbling up more of the calendar with each trip of the world around the sun. This year, Trish was appalled to find Christmas aisles in the big box stores just days after the last trick or treat of Halloween. Little Bean was all of 3 now, but thanks to television, able to recognize the holiday for the first time, she chattered on and on about Santa Claus, one of the few clear phrases Trish was able to pick out of a stream of moist gibberish as little Bee roamed their small apartment in unrepressed delight and rage. If Trish ever said no, anger or joy, little Bean always seemed to be screaming. Every mother Trish knew said, "Mine did the same thing. They grow out of it." Trish made an effort to believe them. Don't take it personally. She tried to believe that too, even under a barrage of "I hate yous." Well, you asked for this. That's what her mother told her. Actually, she hadn't asked for this, not the deadening sameness of motherhood, the isolation of the single mom at the playground, the loss of a future she could now only imagine. Little Bean's dad was supposed to be doing this with her, but he'd wised up, skipped town. She wondered what kind of Christmas he was having. It wasn't that Trish hadn't wanted a child. The truth was she just didn't know. And then she had one, and that child would cry and cry as if desperately wanting something she wasn't getting. But Trish had no idea what it was. Was it because Trish secretly hated breastfeeding, found it painful and somewhat disgusting, her child chewing on her like that? Was it because she never wanted to do this, at least not by herself? Trish had a fleeting notion that one day little Bean would suddenly start speaking, confessing that she could have told her mother what she had wanted at any time. She just hadn't cared to. Little Bean wasn't the only person Trish had to please. She had her mother and father, grandparents, friends, at least a few that were left. A bunch had bolted once they realized Trish, with a kid, was far less fun than Trish without. She had sworn she wasn't going to wait until the last minute to shop, but here she was, Christmas Eve, frantically looking for a parking spot with her child screaming in the back seat. She drove past the big malls. Their parking lots were full, cars prowling the lanes opportunistically, following shoppers walking out of stores with their arms full. She remembered an old mall further out, scheduled to be torn down, but remaining open until the end of the holiday. Maybe she'd find unusual things there for the people on her list. They'd be impressed, especially with her having a difficult kid to take care of. It was already late afternoon. Another heavy snow waited in the night. The streets were flooded in steel gray fog. The road out was poorly lit, with few houses along the way. The last rays of the setting sun made the distant woods appear on fire. An arc of tree limbs protruding from a snowbank resembled a partially buried giant spider. Once past the worn-out welcome to the mall sign, construction barriers guided her through the main level of the old shopping complex. Orange cones and plastic webbing blocked everything. She descended a curved road to the basement level, parking crookedly between piles of debris, but so had everyone else. She got out and lifted Bee from her car seat. Her daughter thankfully was sound asleep. Trish remembered a vast amusement hall on this level. Now the windows were empty and greased. A dark furry shape in the middle of the sidewalk turned out to be the burnt remains of a Christmas tree, a few soot-blackened balls dangling from its skeletal limbs. She was already feeling discouraged about finding anything good here, but she was running out of time, too late to shop anywhere else. She was on a mission to find and buy. Beneath broken concrete, the ground moaned as if collapse were imminent. Some cracked exterior steps led to the main level. As darkness filled the risers, the steps appeared to float in midair. Bee weighed almost nothing. When she got to the top, she checked the blanket to make sure her daughter was still there. The child's face was pale, but her lips moved, as if whispering secrets Trish was not meant to hear. Only a few weary-looking shoppers stared into the dimly lit windows. An older man staggered past her, his overloaded bags hanging down and brushing the snowy sidewalk. His red Christmas sweater bore a giant white clown's face, big googly eyes over the nipples, and a misshapen red nose. A wide, crooked smile, like a rip across the belly. He didn't appear to notice she was there. There was a manger scene in a display window. Someone had replaced the baby Jesus with a dirty doll's head. The other figures were hunched with filth and looked less than human, their tiny faces dismayed. Skinny, melting candles on either side leaned with dangerous possibility. A pile of rags on the sidewalk nearby stretched forth a hand, clutching a can. The mouth sputter that followed might have been please. She gave the generalist's arm a wide berth. Sure, it was a scam. She wanted to think the best of people, but she was never up to the task. A pile of dirty snow was studded with black stones, a waterlogged scarf. It might have just been the remains of a good shoveling, but Trish thought she could make out a face. Dark figures hurried past the mall entrance. Some of them actually ran, in a hurry for disappointment, she'd often heard her father say. Bee stirred as they went through the doors. She thrust her blonde head out of the blanket, looking startled. She began to cry, then stopped as she looked around. Down, she said, and Trish lowered her to the floor. She clutched 3 fingers of her mother's hand. Trish felt relieved. Maybe the kid would behave. She needed at least one thing to go right today. Toys? Bee said weakly, as if afraid of the word. No toys today, Bean, Trish replied. Santa will bring you some tomorrow. We can't be selfish every day. Today we shop for other people. Santa Claus. That's right, Bean, she replied, distracted. From this angle, It was difficult to read the names of the stores. She had no choice but to go down each aisle and find some place still in business. Santy, Bee cried again and broke away, running straight ahead into shadows and dim light. Trish stared for a moment and then shouted, "Bean, come back here." She ran into the murkiness after her, furious. She had absolutely no control over the kid. They were in some kind of central space, poorly lit, and half of it was blocked off where demolition had already begun. Trish was vaguely aware of a few shoppers circling the area, going in and out of shop doors that opened onto this space. Some were blackened silhouettes, like ambulatory fire victims. Trish didn't even see the line of children until she ran into the tail end of it, and Bean, waiting with the others, she grabbed onto her little girl and started to pull her away. "No, Santy," Bean screamed, squirming. "Can I help?" The voice was nearby and below her. Trish looked around. A very short old woman in an elf's cap much too big for her head stared up at her. There's not enough time." Trish was flushed, angry. "There are presents I just have to get. Leave her here and you can shop. We'll take care of her. She'll visit Santa Claus and you'll get your shopping done unencumbered." Santa Claus? Trish gazed up the line to its beginning. There was the big chair holding an old man swallowed up by a voluminous red suit. He appeared to be asleep as a small child chattered into his face. Santa's beard was long, but not very full. Large patches appeared to be missing, and that child, leaning so close to the old man, was eating them. "But I can't just leave her here, can I?" She looked back up at Santa. The next child in line crawled up into his unpromising lap. The old man startled, straightening up so quickly the child almost fell. The large reindeer nearby suddenly came to life, someone in costume, and jumped forward, but Santa had already steadied the child with his knobby hands. "Don't you just hate Christmas? I know I do," the elf woman said. "People are terrible, and the little brats, aren't they just the worst this time of year?" The old woman's grin displayed many missing teeth. Well, yes, sometimes." Trish looked down at Bee, whose eyes were fixed on Santa. "There's just never enough time, and it's not like I get to do anything fun, anything I want to do. It's really not fair." "Do you know what your little girl wants for Christmas?" A new voice, another woman's. Trish turned and was appalled by the towering height of the figure. It was the costume reindeer from Santa's side. How did she get here so fast? The reindeer's suit had brown arms and legs and an enormous white bib covering the torso, a large, grotesquely friendly reindeer head with wide-set eyes staring at some distant point in space. Everything she sees on TV. She jumps up and down and goes crazy over every single toy commercial. She wants it all. Trish hated the way she sounded, but it was the truth. "Don't we all?" the little old woman said. "That makes it easy," the voice inside the giant reindeer head replied. "I'll just have Santa tell her she'll get whatever she wants." "Whatever she wants," Trish repeated. "Well, isn't that great? I'll just settle for getting what I deserve." Sometimes it's the same thing, don't you think? Go shop. We'll take care of her. Everything will turn out as it should. I promise. On my oath as a reindeer. Trish glanced at Bean, still transfixed, shuffling ahead with the other children. No other parents to be seen. She wouldn't even notice her absence. Her daughter was so self-contained. She cared nothing for Trish at all. "I'll hurry," she said, and turned away. Wait, it was the old woman. Trish turned back around. What do you want for Christmas? We'll put in a word for you with the old man. Anything. But Trish had no time to think. Just tell him whatever I want, whatever I deserve. She rushed off, relieved to have a few minutes of shopping time by herself. Bean's dad probably wasn't shopping. He probably wasn't even celebrating Christmas. He was probably just sitting in front of his TV drinking. Maybe that was sad, but Trish envied him. The first place she went into was an antique shop, apparently, and the items, a messy clutter of metal and wood, paper and cloth, were poorly displayed. Of course, they were all going out of business, so a handsome display no longer mattered. And it also didn't matter what she got the relatives, did it? Whatever she got them, Trish knew they would just politely nod. What was the point in trying to please them? She should just do all her shopping here. A grubby artificial Christmas tree stood just inside the door of the shop. It appeared to have been repaired many times, branches taped or wrapped in graying string. A tiny bird skull hung from one branch. Other items on the tree were so mossy with dust they were impossible to identify. Others were identifiable, but as inappropriate as the bird skull. A kitchen whisk, dental floss, a comb, mixed with such traditional decorations as a ceramic angel, an antique star, some lovely blue and green globes. Trish turned and glanced back at the distant Santa line, still moving slowly. She thought she recognized Bean's yellow jumper. With no sales clerk in sight, she ventured deeper into the store. Several collapsing cartons of grubby ornaments filled one table. The hand-lettered sign read seconds. She picked through a few, afraid to dig too deeply in case something nasty lay underneath. Each ornament was distorted in some way, imperfect spheres, lopsided egg shapes, irregular and shifting coloration. The softer ones resembled diseased organs. An assortment of Jesus dolls, folk art, were gathered in a bin. They all looked like bad Jesuses to her. A box labeled fire sale was full of unidentifiable blackened things, all with hooks to hang from a tree. In the central part of the store, stuffed rats hung from a line stretched overhead. Most wore Santa hats. I had a bunch left over from Halloween, but it's the red caps what makes them festive, don't you think? A thin man with a very wide grin peered down at her. His hair was black and slicked back and had rolls of dust. Her mother called them woolies, decorating it here and there. Very clever, she replied. Can I help you find what you want? He asked. I'm not sure I know. Maybe, maybe not, he said. Most of us actually do. We're just too afraid to say. We'll be closing soon, by the way. Trish glanced away, uncomfortable. I just need a few things, and then I have to go retrieve my daughter. She's visiting Santa. Are you sure? They haven't had a Santa in years. He moved a little closer. She could smell the oil in his hair. How could he not know? Santa was set up practically right outside his store. Trish felt she should leave, but stopped herself. She'd be done in just a few minutes, and then she and the bee could go home. Well, they must have changed their minds. I have to hurry along. She went deeper into the shop, away from him and his greasy, dust-laden hair. She picked up a dusty old brooch for her mother. She could clean it, and she'd get one of those defective ornaments for her father. They never liked anything she gave them anyway. And this would let them know exactly how she felt about this horrible, horrible holiday. Maybe they would stop expecting her to come. What a relief that would be. But she still needed something for her sister, the cousins, and whoever else she'd probably forgotten. At the back of the store, was a stack of Victorian Christmas cards. She began thumbing through them quickly, seeking something that might actually impress. The first card to catch her eye bore a picture of an unhappy-looking man in stocks being tormented by a jester. "Happy Christmas to you," it proclaimed. In the next, a seriously wintry scene of ice and snow, a man was being mauled by an angry polar bear. On another, there was some sort of bifurcated root thing with a human head wearing a top hat and monocle. A root branch stuck out like an arm, clutching a heart-shaped object with the message, "A Merry Christmas to you." She held on to these. She didn't really understand them, but they still perfectly expressed everything she was feeling. On one card, a snowman had turned sinister and was threatening a little boy. And here were two dead birds, their feet pointing stiffly upwards. "Merry Christmas and Happy New Year." Then another, "May Christmas be merry," with a frog dancing with a hideous black beetle as a giant fly held aloft a golden ring. They were all suitably unpleasant. What a wonderful, wonderful shop. On another card, a hideous goat creature with long black fur, twisted horns, and a forked tongue threatened a tub full of babies with a giant fork. Was he really planning to skewer them? Maybe this one was too much. She would give it to her father. "That'd be Krampus," the skinny clerk croaked at her elbow. What? He'd scared her so bad she felt dizzy. "Krampus, he's the opposite of the Santa Claus. He's the other one, the one what punishes the children who misbehaved during the year. Tortures them, I reckon. I've got lots of Krampus gear, if you're interested." "No," she cried. "What a terrible idea. Who'd want to invent such a thing?" Guiltily, she dropped the cards. She glanced at her fingertips. They were filthy. She quickly rubbed them on her sleeve. "They invented him to protect the kiddies, I reckon, keep them from getting into trouble. Sometimes you have to scare those little ones just to make them behave. They can be like little animals if you don't." "No, no, you don't," she cried and started for the door. Sometimes the truth is a scary thing. She turned and stared at him. "What's that?" She needs something she's not getting, but the hateful creature won't tell you what it is. You didn't sign up for this. Now, did you? You didn't ask for this. This is not what you wanted at all. The clerk's face had gone dark, as had most of the shop. "I have to go," Trish said, crying. "I have to pick her up." "But it's too late for all that now," the clerk said, invisible, just a rough voice issuing from the dark. "You already made your choice. They're shutting us down. They're tearing down the mall." "Who are they?" Again, the quake in her voice, the awful evidence that she was terrified. "Why, the ones what make the holidays, the ones what make the malls and then tears them all down, the ones what know all the rules in the rule books, but refuse to tell you what they are, the ones what takes the kiddies and does what needs to be done." Trish ran from the store. "But Bean," she shouted at the dark. All light was gone except for a thin line with silver overhead, illuminating a narrow shaft of bright dust, or was it snow? She wandered around in the thickening black, calling her daughter's name, running into things, tripping over what might have been loose tiles or sitting debris. Once she touched what she was sure were antlers and begged Santa's assistant for help, but there was no answer. Feeling further down, she realized it was just a head with nothing inside. Eventually, the dark ahead of her lightened into shadow and then lightened again into an amber mist. She stumbled forward into a field where the mall used to be after they tore it all down. The grass and the tall weeds were whitening gradually under a silencing fall of snow. There, the distant trees whose edges still showed a glimmer of flame. There, the collapsing haystacks and the broken fences. And then among the naked trees, the worn and battered chair, and the withered old man, dressed in faded red, hunched over a yellow bundle in his lap. He appeared to be mumbling something, or was that just Trish mumbling to herself? Please, she said, like that beggar she'd encountered earlier. Please, there's been a misunderstanding. He looked up at her, his beard torn apart, the surrounding skin raw and bleeding. He held the yellow bundle up. No, he said, you were asked whatever you wanted. But I don't know what I wanted. I never have. She rushed forward and yanked the bundle from his arms, holding it tightly against her chest as she ran. She didn't look until later, when she had her child back safely in her car. She wept and apologized, and she promised all she would do to make up for her mistake. But the twisted and weathered log inside the bundle remained silent, although Trish could just make out the beginnings of a nose and the lines of a delicate mouth if she stared long enough into the cracked wood. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Stephen Laws. I'm a horror novelist, and Joseph Freeman has asked me kindly to read one of my stories as part of the Winter Tales event. The story I've chosen is called The Slista, S-L-I-S-T-A, and it was published in the Spectral Book of Horror Stories, edited by Mark Morris. The reason I've chosen this is that the story is also a homage to one of my very favourite horror writers, Richard Matheson, who inspired me enormously when I was a youngster. The inspiration and the homage is to his first published short story ever in July 1950 called Born of Man and Woman. And the story is written in pidgin English about a mutant baby. I'm sure those of you who know your horror will know the name Richard Matheson, and I owe him a great debt. So The Slista is my tribute to him. The Slista, as will become apparent, is a creature of foreboding, but I got the title and name from an overheard conversation on the top deck of a bus when a little girl was talking to her mother and asked her, "Mom, what's a Slista?" That's all I'll say about that. The Slista. "You must be good," says Survival. "You must be good, or the Slista will come get you." Survival has been telling us about the Slista long as we can remember. It is the only thing what we are fright about. No thing other has us affright. Not the hair things I done found called rats now, which can bite and go scratch but taste good. Not the all kinds big noise that go past window of our under the ground place in the big house. Not the sky thunders, not nothing else, but the Slista. This is the big scare thing. Survival told us long time that we're all safe here in the underground place where no one go. No one know we here. 5 of us. We are the family, me, and my name is Critch, which now I can write when I've been looking at storybook brung down once by Svivel. Then there is Kate, who is next down from me, then Morris, he boy, then Declan and True. One time there was 6, but Kenny come out of Kate very little small, and he not good with noises. No noise be made when peoples come. That is why we be safe all time. So Svivel he come down from up the stair place very annoyed, and Kenny not make noise no more, and we not need rats for long time. Svivel say, no noise, or people here, and tell the solicitor. It come home and taken us all to bad place away from underground place. So, shh. We all have the big love here in Dog. We all brothers, that is word in book. And sisters, that is also word in book. We strong, but all different. Kate has fingers good for tear up. Morris, he fast and move, no hearing noises. Declan, eyes that see through and tell all. True, gone up wall to ceiling, that word from book. True, teeth long and sharp for biting. Me, all kinds things, but me big one, and love and keep all. Then one day, Svivel come down, say, listen. We listen, and there are noises coming up with his voice. Wet noises. His 2 eyes wet, and I say, Svivel, what is wrong? He sit bump on wood stair and say, you all must listen. We listen, and he say, I'm going sleep and no wake like Kenny. Morris make wet eyes, but Svivel say, no, 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 and no. I have been telling many times that all sleep long time, but go happy place. Isn't that right? Morris make eyes dry, and we say, yes, Svivel, we always ready for long sleep, and not being sad because you said. Svivel nod and say, yes, yes, you must let me go to long time sleeping place, and you must all leave the big love in the downstairs dark. Go out and find different big love in the downstairs dark. There are lots of them. One will be waiting somewheres for you, so you will find it. Why? Asked True. Why, Svivel, if you go to long time sleeping place, we no stay in the big love here? Because, says Svivel, and you must not be feared, I must go to long time sleeping place very soon, and the solicitor will come. Now we are afraid, but Svivel say, no, do not be afraid. The solicitor will come in the big car. You remember, big car what you seen through little looking place? We say, yes, Svivel, we remember big car. Well, says Svivel, he come in big car and find me in long time sleeping place, and he say, good, now I will eat Svivel and take away big house. But you will be gone long way to different place, and he will not be finding any of Svivel's lovelies. How can the solicitor be doing these things, we ask? Svivel say. The solicitor come from big place, called office or offices, with magic papers that have magic words that can take happy places and happy peoples like us away forever. We all ask, what must we do, Svivel? Be gone away, says Svivel, and remember all things I've been telling you since little times. Look after you and use all. Protect and keep the big love. These are the rules of Svivel, he says. And then he is gone to long time sleeping place there on the wood stair, and at same time, with no time for the wet eyes, True says, listen, there is noise of the big car outside. We go run little looking place, and yes, there is big car. Do not be afraid, I say, when man in black cloth, wrap stuff get out of big car and come with square bag. But I am afraid inside, because this is the solicitor, and square bag will have magic papers and magic words, but also and but I am big one for love and keep all, and I am now new Svivel, because old Svivel is now gone to long time sleeping place. so I must be the big up. Morris, I say, be fast, and go to the up the stair place and be make no noise. Declan, I say, go also and open the ding-dong door. When go ding-dong, then hide up on high place. True, I say, you go other too, and up on the wall, ceiling, for to wait. When ding-dong door go ding-dong, I will be speaking with Spival voice, and I will say, come in, why don't you? Like we hear before lots of times. My Spival voice better, 'cause it's rumbler than other lovelies. Kate, I say, be ready with fingers. True, I say, also to be ready with the biting. We go, and we are being ready. Ding-dong, says the ding-dong door. So now we are being going away from the old big love under the ground old place. And, just like the old Spival said, we are finding the new big love under the ground new place, and we are ready to come into it. When the peoples who are in the up the stairs don't see, me and the lovelies will come into it and be new happy. They are wanting me to keep old name Critch, but I say, oh no, I will be now the new Spival, not the old Critch, because that is the job of the oldest to do. And they say, oh, all right, yes, then I'm glad. But I am good inside, because they love me as the old Critch and will love me as the new Spival. Spival was kind to us, and I will be kind to them. This is the laws of Spival. Remember? I will be kind, and we will be warm and happy, and hurt anyone what will want harm us. We will eat nice things all time, nicer and nicer things. And when long sleep will come for me, then Kate will be new Spival after me, and we will be going on. I like thinking when I go long time sleeping place, they will be eat of me, and I will be of them, here in bodies, and of them in long time sleeping place also. Happy, like when we eat old Spival, but not happy like when we eat the slister. Ye not tasting nice, not nice at all.
My name is Lynda Rucker, and these are the woods where I grew up. For this project, I thought it would be cool to come to the woods as it got dark and tell you a story. My story is called The Queen in the Yellow Wallpaper. That title you may recognize as a mashup between Robert Chambers' The King in Yellow and Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. It was originally published in The Burning Circus, which was a anthology issued by the British Fantasy Society, edited by Johnny Maines, and it was reprinted in my collection. You'll know when you get there, from Swan River Press, which came out in 2016, still available. And I'm just going to read the story to you as it gets dark. I brought a flashlight in case it gets too dark. Without further ado, here we go. The Queen in the Yellow Wallpaper. We have come to Carcosa. That's the name, anyway, that my partner's sister gave this house in some flight of fancy back when she was still well, or so we thought. And I suppose even at that stage she might have been what? Starting her descent into madness sounds so very gothic nowadays. We use words like bipolar and major depressive disorder to make it sound like those episodes are mere maladies which require only a proper course of treatment to set their sufferers on the path to a cure. And yet what bedevils Sarah seems not so much a disease of the mind or body as it is a sickness of her soul. And I don't believe in the soul. But for as long as I've known her, for the dozen years that Adam and I have been together, there's been a kind of shadow over Sarah. The rest of the family is happy-go-lucky, even annoyingly so, as though Sarah has always taken on the burden of sorrow for the rest of them. But you see, Sarah's peripatetic habits of mind seem already a creeping influence on me here. I don't work as a scientist, but I'm trained as one, and it isn't like me to indulge in these sorts of whims. It's the middle of the night here, and I'm tired and stressed out, and in this state I'm no help to Adam or Sarah. In the middle of the night, my imaginings get the better of me. My fears take shape and peel themselves from the ugly yellow wallpaper someone's maligned the walls with, and they stalk the corridors of Carcosa. They ooze like ectoplasm round my thoughts to fog my brain. More tomorrow, when I'm feeling myself again. So, first things first. We have come here, Adam and I, to look after his older sister Sarah, or rather, Adam has come to look after Sarah, and I have come because I go where Adam goes. That doesn't sound right somehow. That is not what I ever intended, and yet it has become the way. It came upon us gradually, as these things do, this intertwining. There were the career goals that clashed, practically and geographically, late nights and tears, a counselor to talk us through it all, because we are responsible, middle-class people who don't give up on a marriage without a fight. And in the end, a capitulation on my part. Did I say capitulation? I meant compromise, of course. My dream was the more impractical of the two, given the circumstances. Not impossible, not even unrealistic, but certainly impractical in a modern world where two modern people both want certain things. Does it matter, specifically, the substance of our competing goals? In the end, I think not. It's an ordinary story, lived daily in millions of ordinary lives. Adam won. I lost. Life goes on. But in the end, this capitulation has left me dependent on Adam. Not utterly, and Adam would blanch at my use of the word dependent. He sees us as interdependent, maybe symbiotic, perhaps tethered. No, not tethered, that implies two, and Adam resolutely wants us to be one. If we are one, then nobody has won, and nobody has lost. And yet here is another capitulation, albeit a smaller one. While Adam was granted a leave of absence to take care of the full-fledged family emergency, I had to quit my job to come here to Carcosa. I didn't like my job. It's not what I trained to do or ever imagined doing. I was little more than a glorified receptionist in an office, surrounded by people all doing much more important things than me. But it was something. It was mine. There was never any question of my staying behind. We must remain a united front. It's why people cleave to one another. It's what we do. It's our way of ensuring we are never alone in the dark. It's strange for me because Sarah and I have never been close. Sarah is the sort of woman who makes me feel uncomfortable, to be honest. She's very intense in that New York City artist kind of way. In fact, a New York City artist is exactly what she is, a playwright, and a rather good one from all accounts. I say from all accounts because experimental and avant-garde theater is far from my forte. I have attended a couple of performances of Sarah's plays and came away baffled and a little bit disturbed. One appeared to be the tale of an erotic triangle between a woman, also played by Sarah, a dwarf, and here I admit I don't know what it was. I'm not even sure it was human. I think they were living on the edge of a cliff, and I think the cliff was symbolic of something. You see, I have no idea what I was watching. It was the sort of thing people describe afterwards as challenging. One reviewer wrote that it invented and then smashed new paradigms, whatever that means. She's working on another play now. It's mostly what she does all day, every day, holed up in her room. I'm not sure it's good for her. I think it may be feeding her depression or whatever it is she's going through, but Adam says it's good for her to have work to do. Sarah has strong features and a severe black bob, and she doesn't smile very easily. She's attractive, but attractive like an elaborate and expensive piece of jewelry, all glitter and sharp edges. She has, from what Adam tells me, always suffered from depressions, and malaises and manic periods, but none of that ever seemed unmanageable until Carcosa. Now, Carcosa, I have not even begun to describe you. Carcosa is a sprawling heap of a house. It's the house of my bookish childhood fantasies. You know the sort. Old and rambling and surely possessed of hidden doors and passageways and gruesome secrets. It's an odd color, coated in a sort of sickly yellow-green paint, from its once grand but now sagging front steps and porch to its two actual turrets thrusting out from the house at the front, into which it is unsafe to walk as rainwater has leaked through the roofs for years and rotted their flooring. It's in desperate need of money and attention, of which Sarah has neither. How she came into possession of the place is peculiarly Gothic as well. She was married for a short time to a man whom none of the family knew well, and Adam and I never even met. They decamped from her cramped Williamsburg apartment to his ancestral home here, and then quite suddenly, he died. He had no family at all, and the house passed to Sarah. The house is old, its foundations and inner rooms dating back to colonial times. Each generation that came into possession of it made additions and architectural embellishments, and what stands today is a sort of hideous, discordant symphony of a house. If one can believe Sarah's accounts, and that's a big if, and if you believe in this sort of thing, Adam and I do not. It was passed around between rich and decadent artistic and occult dilettantes, inciting the usual sorts of rumors of shocking activity, sacrifice, and summons to supernatural entities. There was at some stage round the turn of the 20th century a rather grand week-long affair that ended in many of the participants' breakdowns, and there may have been a crime committed. When she comes to this part, Sarah is more than usually reticent. I imagine the specter of this madness has infected the walls and seeped into the floorboards and lingers in the very air that we're breathing. This is all I know about Carcosa. The backyard is crawling with tangles of thorn and brush and infested by biting insects. The front is overgrown as well, but only with weeds and grass. Adam keeps saying we must look for a mower on the premises, but he never does. The yard is enormous. The house is enormous. I keep trying to count how many rooms it actually contains and losing track. Plus there are little areas within rooms, alcoves set apart by steps going up or down, or at least in one case, rotting curtains dividing one area from the other. I say at least one case because I have trouble keeping the rooms straight, and sometimes I count them more than once, and I cannot decide whether these are separate rooms or not. If I didn't know any better, I would think someone was creeping into the house at night and rearranging the rooms to trick us. It's a house that ought to be allowed to disintegrate quietly into its own memory and ruin. It's an unhealthy house. Let me rephrase that. It seems to be an unhealthy atmosphere for Sarah, which is not to say that the house itself is unhealthy. That's a bit of a bizarre anthropomorphism, isn't it? It's not what I meant to say. I have told Adam that I think it's best if he works toward getting Sarah into a different environment, even once she's well. I think she would do better in an apartment in town. Anybody would. It seems to me that the worst excesses of Carcosa would prey upon even the strongest and healthiest minds, let alone one already racked by illness like Sarah's. I told Adam this after he came to bed last night, late, because Sarah's been having crying fits, and sometimes he's afraid to leave her alone. But he didn't say anything back to me at all. I knew that this would be challenging, but it's proving to be more difficult than I ever imagined. There is not really an end date for our time here. It seems mad to say that this did not occur to me, but it didn't. We didn't set out from our nice suburban Massachusetts home into the countryside as though we were embarking on some long journey. We didn't batten the hatches. We didn't even pack much of our stuff. We were careless in bidding our friends goodbye. I'll catch up with them online, I thought, and I'll see them in a few weeks. It never occurred to me that there would be no online in Carcosa. Even were one to run cables under the earth or launch a satellite to catch a passing signal, I feel sure the house itself would strangle the transmission. Our phones don't work here either. It feels eerie, like we're trapped in one of those stories where we're already dead and we don't yet realize it. Adam thinks our isolation is wonderful. He points out that Sarah has had a landline installed, so I can still phone someone if I'm feeling lonely, and it isn't as though we can't take the car and go into town when we need a break. In the meantime, he says, isn't it nice to be away from all that? I don't know what he means by all that, and even though he says we can go into town any time, we never do. Adam is afraid to leave Sarah on her own, so I've taken the car out a few times for a drive. But there's not really a town to go into anyway, just a series of winding rural roads that eventually give way to a grim main street lined with closed or failing businesses. I suppose this place must have been prosperous 100 years ago. Anyway, I worried about getting lost, and the GPS was acting up, and it just didn't seem worth the trip and the fretting anyway. In town, there wasn't even a cafe to stop at for a cup of coffee. I did visit the grocery store, and the bright lights shocked me. I had not realized that Carcosa is swathed in a kind of perpetual gloom. At the store, people laughed and talked loudly, spoke into their phones, wrangled their disruptive children. I reveled in it. I said to the man at the meat counter that the steaks looked nice, and I bought 3 of them, 1 for each of us, and I chatted with a woman by the freezer about the weather we'd been having. Weather? At Carcosa, I hardly notice weather. And the cashier and I commiserated about the price of gas these days. As I pushed my car across the parking lot, I felt almost lighthearted, and I recognized this feeling as one I used to call ordinary. Back at Carcosa, I tried to speak to Adam about how long we'll be staying here, and he laughed at my concern. He said I was being dramatic. He said we were just getting Sarah stabilized. Didn't I remember that she sometimes had these episodes, and once we got her into a pattern of taking her meds again, once we got her past this rough patch, everything would be fine. Fine, I wanted to say. Leaving a mentally ill woman here, as Carcosa sounds fine to you. But I didn't say that. I said, this rough patch, how long does it last? And he laughed again, and he said even doctors can't answer a question like that, now can they? And then he went on his way, just like we'd had an actual satisfactory conversation with a resolution and everything. And I sat in the living room, parlor, sitting room. As I've said, this house has so many rooms, and it's not really clear what the purpose for most of them is. And I wondered just how that talk had gone so badly. I had even tried using some of the techniques that the counselor had taught us years ago. When you do X, I feel Y. It didn't seem to work. I thought those things would work. I just thought things would work better. So we've been here 10 days now. It seems like longer. It seems like my whole life I've been opening my eyes to the lumpy yellow ceiling that's above our bed in Carcosa, and that each day will begin in this way for the rest of my life. I don't know what Adam does with his time, with his days. Sometimes I go hours without seeing him. He spends time with Sarah, of course. I try to do so as well, but my presence seems to upset her. She showed me a few pages of the play at one stage, out of order, and I couldn't make head or tails of them, and that made her angry. I want to be a help for both of them, but it seems the best way I can do that is to be as invisible as possible, and do things that are needed, making sandwiches for everyone's lunches, that sort of thing. These little tasks don't take me very long, so I've had to find other things to interest me. I have become particularly interested in the north turret. That I cannot step into it across its threshold because it is dangerous. I find this so compelling. I want to step into it. I feel like it's taunting me, this turret. This is the one from which I always imagine I hear the footsteps, the dragging noises. That's my overactive imagination, of course. There's a bad smell coming from it, not my imagination, because at some stage some ill-advised person put down carpet, and the carpet is rotting. The carpet is a sort of burnt orange, and it clashes with the unpleasant yellow wallpaper. Possibly this was fashionable in the 1970s, which was probably the last time anyone put any money into the place. Today the effect is not fashionable, but horrific. A fashion crime. I am trying to be flippant. There's no flippancy in this house, no humor. Even that word I wrote, crime, I'm looking at it and it's taking on sinister aspects. 3 isolated people alone in a country house, and one's thoughts turn to murder. Such is the power of Carcosa, you know. Today Adam came across me there, sitting on the floor just outside the turret. He startled me. I hadn't heard anyone stirring in the house for hours. I felt his appearance had spoiled something. You see, I have this fanciful idea about the north turret. I imagine that if I were to cross the threshold, I would not step into the foul, carpeted, floorboard, rotted, ugly, wallpapered turret, but into another reality, another world, like a children's story where they walk through a door in the wall into another land. And I suppose there's a part of me that wants to step out of this place and into another world, one where everything is different. Adam said, "What are you doing here? I've been looking all over for you." I said, "I've been right here the whole time." "Adam, do you think this turret has changed?" "Changed how?" "From the rest of the house?" "It's certainly uglier." "Changed from how it was yesterday and the day before that?" "That sounds like something out of one of Natalie's plays." "Maybe it's catching," Adam said. And we waited there for a little while longer, watching the turret room, just in case. But it stayed the same, and so did we. Tonight I cooked the steaks I'd bought us in town. I thought it would be a nice treat, but Adam came in the kitchen looking at me like I was crazy and asked me what I was doing. I said I thought I was making dinner. "What the hell," he said. "You know Sarah's a vegetarian." I do know that Sarah's a vegetarian. I know this very well, and I stared at the steaks sizzling in the pan. Very good steaks, nice marbled cuts. I planned to serve up rare and succulent, and I wondered what the hell I'd been thinking before Adam even got around to asking that as a follow-up question. I said I don't know what I was thinking. I guess I wasn't. "Look, I'll fix her a salad or something." You see, though, it's little things like that, insignificant maybe, that make me feel as though I'm not myself. And I imagine it's the place, Carcosa, exerting its influence and turning my own mind shaky and unfamiliar. If being here is having this effect on me, what must it do to Sarah? Then Adam said he thinks the play Sarah's writing is upsetting her, that he wants her to stop working on it, but he doesn't know how to make her stop. Has he tried asking her, I want to know? I would describe the look he gave me as withering. Of course he has requested, he has demanded, he has cajoled, he has even shouted. All to no avail. Sarah goes on writing. We talk some more. I take the steaks out to rest. I finally begin to get a sense of what Adam is doing all day. It's the damn play. When they were children, Sarah had bossed him around. She'd scribble down stories and force him to act all the parts, and this time, it seems, things are no different. She's working very hard on this particular play, and she seems very determined. I asked him what the play is about, and he had a hard time describing it to me. He said it was about a woman isolated in a strange house in the country, and I said like this place, and he looked startled and said no, not like this place at all. It's very different, but he couldn't say how. He said the woman in the play was in a house because people had forced her to stay there. I asked what people, and he shook his head and said that wasn't really an important part of the story, but the way he said it made me feel like it might be the most important part, and that he just didn't want to talk about it. He seemed shaken. Then he said, a queen arrived. At the house, I said, in the middle of nowhere. The queen of what? Adam said, a terrible queen. Her presence drives people to madness. That doesn't sound like the healthiest subject matter for my sister-in-law, does it? I said so to Adam. She wants to talk with you, he said. She wants your opinion of the play. My opinion? What do I know about that sort of thing? It doesn't matter what you tell her, Adam said. Doesn't it? Sarah isn't an idiot or a child. What are we doing here anyway? I thought we came here to offer a bit of familial support, not a full program of medical assistance like we're staff in an institution. Anyway, maybe Sarah needs to go to one of those institutions for a while. Or whatever they call them now. I guess they just say people are hospitalized. Who's her doctor anyway? Shouldn't she be seeing someone regularly? I said I would talk to her after dinner, but I didn't want to eat steak any longer. I wrapped up 2 of them and put them in the fridge while Adam wolfed his down. I threw some lettuce and tomatoes into a bowl and called it a salad. And now I'm sitting alone in the kitchen with my notebook and the salad. making up excuses in my head for all the reasons that I don't want to go into Sarah's room. Her room is down a long corridor on the ground floor, with 2 sets of 3 steps each taking you down to a lower level. I knocked on the door and she opened it. I hadn't seen her in days. Her eyes were bright, eager, and feverish. I was struck by how thin she seemed. Sarah's always been bird-like in build, but this is something more, as though there's simply no substantial meat left on her bones at all. Her normally severe black bob was uncombed and unsevere. "I'm so glad you came," Sarah said, like I was a neighbor paying her a social call. She put her hand on my free wrist, the one not holding the sad excuse for a salad. She felt dry and fragile and hot. I held the salad out in front of me like a shield. "I made you dinner," I said. "Oh, thank you," Sarah said, and took it from me without looking at it and set it aside. I took a moment to look around the room. It had that smell about it of a closed-up place where someone has been spending too much time. It was disarrayed, covered in Sarah's clothing and papers that had things scribbled and crossed out on them. "Sit here," Sarah said, retreating to the edge of an unmade wrought-iron single bed. I sat beside her. She rummaged under the bedclothes and pulled out a stack of papers and thrust them at me. "Tell me what you think," she demanded. "Oh, Sarah, I'm hardly qualified. Just do it," she said. "Adam can't understand. It's not for him, you know. For men. It's a play for women, about what they do to us." I said, "I really don't." "Read it out loud," she said. "It's the only way to read a play. Do it now." I did as she told me. At the same time, I was thinking that the easiest way to get out of there was to do as she asks, and I felt quite determined that as soon as I left I was going to talk to Adam. There was nothing more we could do for Sarah here. She needed more help than we could give. But I began to read the play, and though it was only words on a page, a strange emotion overcame me. I can only describe the reading of it as being akin to listening to a powerful piece of music. It moved me in the same way that songs can capture your emotions so primally, the way they can gut you, the way they have a rhythm and a life to them. The play felt like a spell. The reason that Adam had been unable to describe it to me is that the events that unfold in it are the least of it. Everything in a play is a vehicle for the intoxicated words that Sarah must have scribbled during all-night manias. They made me feel manic, but exhilarated as well. And the characters, there are more of them than I expected from what Adam had said in describing the main characters as isolated, and I found myself wondering if they had somehow not made an appearance for him. And the characters kept saying to one another, the Queen is coming," and whenever they did so, I felt a shudder of pleasure and anticipation so intense I could scarcely keep myself from crying out. It is savage. The play is a savage thing. Of course, I recognized the setting as Carcosa, and how stupid Adam was not to have done so immediately. Tears pricked my eyes as I set down the last page and turned to Sarah, sitting next to me on the bed. "When will she be here?" I said. "The Queen, I mean." She smiled at me and said it won't be long now at all. I meant in the play, or did I? I was starting to feel confused. Had I, too, not dreamed of the arrival of the Queen? A shadowy figure stepping out of the turret room, royal robes made of skin and memory and deceit, beauty from rot. All Carcosa would be transformed when she walked among us at last. I've just read what I've written here, the last bit above. It isn't like me. It isn't me. I knew this was a bad place. I don't believe in the things I'm writing about here. There must be some explanation, some poison in the house seeping into our brains and changing our thoughts. The place ought to be inspected for the kinds of things and probably torn down. But that's later. For the present, I must find Adam and persuade him that we all must leave. I'm ashamed to write what happened next with Sarah. Adam, of course, must never know. If she tells him I shall feign ignorance, I will remind him of her madness. She said she was the Queen's proxy, and I believed her. When she kissed me, it was the most beautiful and terrible secret thing. Later I woke, and I didn't know where I was. Sarah was still asleep next to me, and for many dreadful seconds I didn't recognize her. I dressed as quietly and as quickly as I could, and I hurried out of the room, and I have since been searching for Adam, and he's nowhere to be seen, and I'm so frightened without reason, and no one to tell, and feeling that if I write it all down, I will make sense of it somehow soon. I'm going to burn these pages shortly. It is dusk. I'm outside the turret room again. I have been here for some time. I don't know how long, but I've seen the sun pass through the sky at least twice, or perhaps thrice. Sarah looks after me. She brings me water and a little food, but I only drink. I don't eat. I want to be as pure as possible for the arrival of the Queen. I don't know where Adam is spending his days any longer. I saw him once from the window, but I cannot understand how he made his way so deep into the thickets of the backyard. He may be lost out there for all I know, but Sarah says it's nothing to concern myself with, even though he appears to have stripped himself naked at some point, for I can see bits of his tattered clothing stuck to brambles and flapping forlornly in the wind that is kicking up all around Carcosa. It's been blowing very hard for a while now, maybe hours, maybe days. It's hard to tell. I don't remember when I began to lose track of the time. That's funny, isn't it? Because if I knew, that would mean I wouldn't lost track, wouldn't it? I don't remember because it doesn't matter. Because she will be with us soon, and when she is here, all that is will collapse into ruin, just like Carcosa. Sarah has been so very hard at work, writing her into reality, drawing her into being. The wind is howling at us like a living thing. I can't tell if it is on our side or not. Sarah keeps coming in and reciting new lines, and when she does, the wind screams louder, nearly drowning her voice. She reads these words to me, and something wakes in the darkness, and wakes in the air, and wakes in my bones, and we wait for our goddess, our ruler of Carcosa, our charnel queen. Something stirs in the turret, something long asleep, something stretching, something starting to be. And we gaze into her shadows, into her bleak beauty, into her nothingness, into her void. She is the hollowness that haunts us all. She is the abyss. She is the dark behind the dark and the emptiness of collapsing stars, and she draws us into her sweet embrace.
And Robert Lionel Fanthorpe, and I was born at 21 Norwich Road, Dereham, in Norfolk, the eldest son of Robert Fanthorpe and Greta Christine Fanthorpe, née Garbett. And my birthday was February the 9th, 1935. I went first to Victoria College, which was a private infant school run by Miss Grace Mason, and from there I attended the Norfolk County Council Theatre Street Junior School, which was followed by Langley Park School and then Hammond's Grammar School in Swaffham. When I wanted to dodge difficult lessons that I particularly disliked, I would hide in the Hammond's Grammar School library, ducking between high shelves where the master on duty couldn't see me. And while hiding there, I read H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, Bram Stoker and Edgar Allan Poe from the shelves near my hiding place. Their stories inspired me to research and then to write about real-life unsolved mysteries, such as Rennes-le-Chateau, Oak Island, Easter Island, the Barbados Coffins, and the Green Children of Woolpit. Many of these real-life mysteries were published by Dundurn of Canada, and I also wrote a lot of religious books for Bishopsgate Press in London. I didn't like school at all, and I left with no qualifications in 1949, started work as an apprentice dental technician with Charter Start, who was a dentist in Norwich Street in Dereham in Norfolk. And here I worked in the lab with Alan Thacker, who ran a small band called the Alan Thacker Quartet. And I used to go on gigs with them, helping them to carry their instruments. As a young man, I did a variety of jobs. I was a machinist for Metamec clocks, then a farm worker, a gents hairdresser, a journalist running the Cromer office for the Norfolk Chronicle, which belonged to Sir Thomas Cook. I also worked as a van driver, an electrical storekeeper, a showroom assistant, and a warehouse man. Patricia and I got married on September the 7th, 1957, and we've recently celebrated our 64th wedding anniversary. And she's worked with me as my co-author since our marriage. I sold my first story, Worlds Without End, to Badger Books in 1952, and they published it in Futuristic Science Stories No. 6 under my Lionel Roberts pen name. Now, about 200 books later, I'm still in print in 2022, which sounds suspiciously like another 70th anniversary. I had the privilege of meeting Guy M. Smith, a very likeable friend and an outstandingly good writer. And at one time, we competed hard against each other in the Guinness records to determine which of us was the fastest professional writer. And Guy paid me the very warm compliment of telling me that as a boy and a young man, he had greatly enjoyed reading my paperback Badger books. He would have been 12 when Worlds Without End was published. Everybody's been so keen to get away on holidays since lockdown finished that these tower rooms are the only accommodation I've got left, said Alex Maguire apologetically. Frank and Harry Gilmore looked at each other questioningly and then smiled at Alex. I'm sure they'll be fine, said Frank. Alex looked at their luggage and fishing gear. They're not far from the river, he said, and I can see you've come for the fishing. We've also come to learn what we can about the legends of the water monsters, said Harry. Maguire looked troubled. My father and grandfather both claimed to have seen the monster in Loch Morar, the one they call Morag, he said quietly, as well as numerous kelpies and demonic water horses. Did they know anything about the Mester Stour worm, asked Frank. Did they ever see it? Maguire shook his head. They often talked about it, but I don't think they ever saw it, he hesitated. Good thing they didn't, in my opinion. The locals say it's so strong it can crush a boat to splinters between its claws, then fish the crew out of the loch and eat them. Maguire handed the tower keys to Harry and headed back towards his office. The Gilmores opened the outer doors, looked around carefully before stepping inside. From the wide stone hallway just within the impressive iron-studded outer door, there were 2 flights of stairs. One led up to the tower's living rooms, the other led down into what the Gilmore brothers imagined would be storage cellars or even dungeons dating back to when the tower was built centuries ago. As they climbed to the first floor, they noticed a medieval spear mounted on the wall. The brass tablet immediately below it was inscribed in immaculate Gothic lettering. Wielded by Sir Hector Maguire in 1356 to repel an attack by the Mester Stour worm. He must have been a warrior indeed if he drove that monster off, said Harry admiringly. I think I've read a bit about him somewhere in Scottish history, said Frank. If I'm remembering it right, Hector leapt in and attacked the worm to save a girl it was pursuing. The version I read said that he leapt on its back and plunged his spear all the way into it while the girl escaped. Then he withdrew his sword to make a second thrust, but the worm escaped into the sea. They opened the nearby bedroom door and stepped inside with their luggage and fishing tackle. I'm not psychic, said Frank thoughtfully, but there's an odd atmosphere in here. Do you remember when we went on that Jack the Ripper tour in Miller's Court in London years ago, asked Harry. Yes, we went into that room where Mary Jane Kelly had been murdered. And I got exactly that same feeling that I've got now, said Frank. He shivered. Yeah, I know what you mean, said Harry. It's as if a trapped spirit is lingering here. They stacked the fishing tackle and rods carefully into one corner and unpacked their other luggage. Then they got into the twin beds and tried to sleep. It did not come easily. I just about got rid of the Mary Keller horrors that were bugging my mind when my mind filled with pictures of Hector Maguire fighting the worm with that great spear on the wall, said Harry. Oh, I can't sleep either, said Frank. For some reason, I keep seeing pictures of that other staircase, the one that descends. Well, maybe if we went and examined it to make sure it's completely harmless, that'll set our minds at rest, suggested Harry. Okay by me, said Frank. Within 5 minutes, they were down at ground level, looking tentatively at the descending staircase. Maybe I'm just being overcautious, but I'd feel safer if I'd got Hector's spear in one hand, said Harry. I know exactly how you feel, said Frank. Harry reascended the stairs, lifted the spear from its display shelf, and came back to ground level. Let's explore, said Frank. They headed carefully down the stairs. Listen, whispered Harry. Can you hear something squealing? Frank listened carefully, tilting his head to one side. Yes, he said. Something below us is definitely squeaking and squealing. Harry led on down the stairs, holding the spear tightly. At the 15th step, he reached a broad stone landing with doors leading off it in 4 directions. The squealing and squeaking were coming from behind the door, directly ahead of them. They were looking at each other questioningly, when Maguire suddenly appeared on the stairs immediately above them. He had a gun in his left hand. Are you both all right? He asked. Yeah, we're fine, said Harry. Any idea what that noise might be? Asked Frank. My remote ancestor, Hector, supposedly fought off the Mester Stour worm. He rescued the girl it was pursuing, and they married soon afterwards. Part of the legend said that before Hector fought it off, the worm had laid eggs down here, hidden deep below the tower, and apparently they can take centuries to hatch. So is that what we can hear? All three stood stock still, listened as the squeaking and squealing grew louder. They moved steadily towards it, and Maguire opened the door carefully. The room was full of the weirdest and strangest looking maggots that any of them had ever seen. I've got an old-fashioned insect destroyer in my tool shed, said Maguire. It squirts fire. He began racing up the stairs while Harry pointed his spear at the writhing mass of weird maggots. Maguire raced back with the miniature flamethrower and began spraying flames into the squirming pile. The battle was over within minutes, and only the burning smell remained in the cellar. They carefully replaced Hector's spear. "We should put up a second brass plate there with your name on it," said Frank. "I'd like that," said Alex with a gentle smile. "Meanwhile, I think it will be wise to refill my flamethrower."
Here's an old story of mine that I thought I would dig up and see if I could bring back to some kind of life. It's one that proved very popular and even won an award for me when it first appeared some 20 years ago. It derives very much from my driving across the countryside at all hours of the day and night, tracking down well-known haunted locations, often finding a lingering spooky atmosphere and sometimes finding more than that. I trust that on this cold winter's day, it's a story that will warm the spirits. The needle on the petrol gauge had just dropped into red when Barker saw the sign. "Beware of the children," it read. Though he quickly assumed that it had been put there to protect the children themselves from the motorists rather than vice versa, it nonetheless sent a chill down his spine, and he glanced at his watch and from the corner of his eye noticed that the evening was drawing darkness into itself quickly. The car would give him another 20 or 30 miles before it needed filling up again, and he could find a petrol station in one of the small towns on the other side of the A12 when he'd finished here. He'd be alright for now. He'd spent what felt like best part of a day driving across Suffolk looking for this place, and now he was here, he wasn't about to get distracted too easily. He swung the car into the bend, away from the carriageway, and into deep shadows. So this was it, he thought, the road to Brockhampton Institute. The place was legendary. He'd been reading about it for years and wanting to visit it almost as long. Trying to come up with an idea for a photo feature to sell to a popular paranormal magazine had given him the ideal opportunity, and now he felt a delicious thrill as he nosed the car deeper into the remote countryside. Spindly trees overhung the track and reached for him with gnarled limbs. Here in the gloom, everything looked stale or dead. It was hard to believe that this track could ever have led to any kind of institute, even one as remote and demanding of privacy as Brockhampton had been. The very thought of the things that used to take place here benefiting from its remote location and inaccessibility made his skin crawl. He navigated the track carefully, headlights picking out gaping potholes and tree roots. It was getting darker than he would have liked, but he wasn't about to risk doing the vehicle any damage by going faster over this kind of terrain. He promised himself that he would stay no longer than was necessary to give the building the quick once-over, soak up the atmosphere, shoot off a roll of film, and make his way back to the main road. It wasn't that the expedition bothered him. If he was that easily spooked, then he would never have volunteered himself for such a trip, but it had already taken up much more of his time than he would have liked. After another 100 yards, the track ended at a set of iron gates, and he pulled the car over to the embankment with a groan, as if gates were needed to keep anyone away after such a hostile track as that. He couldn't see from here if they were locked or not. He'd have to get out and check for himself. The temperature had been pleasantly warm all day, and it was only slightly cooler now with the evening darkness as he strode the short distance. A metal plaque on the gatepost was made illegible by age and weathering. The gates were locked. He curled his fists around the rusted bars and shook them as much as he dared, but their noise in the stillness of the evening jarred at his nerves, and he slumped against them. He would have to climb the gates and walk the rest of the way. Barker returned to his car long enough to shrug on his jacket, sling his rucksack and camera over his shoulder. The gates clanged and shook as he hoisted his weight onto them, but as he waited at the top for them to settle, he felt them holding firmly. A breeze ran cold fingers through his hair as he stared up at the shadows beyond, and then swung himself over the top and dropped down to the other side. As he stood up, the sullen quiet and stillness of the evening hit him. There was never anything like this back in the city, he realised. There was always some background noise covering the natural silence as effectively as wallpaper covering a bare wall. Here, there was only the sound of his own panting breath, of his footsteps as he walked towards the Institute, the sigh of a breeze that raced to catch up with him every so often. There were no streetlights or houses for over a dozen miles in any direction, and the sky above was a luxurious purple, darkening by the minute and studded with glimmering stars. He didn't know if he cared for it much. Perhaps he was too urbanized now after 34 years of city life. Here, it felt as though the world were waiting for something to happen to him. The driveway opened out and the trees fell back, and there in a large clearing was the Brockhampton Institute. Closed now for 20 years, since the children there had done what they did. The fire that gutted the building had been the least of it. Barker tried to picture the three-story building on fire, flames licking at the night sky, clawing for the stars above. When the screaming started deep in his mind, he cut the thought off and shook himself in order to disguise the shiver that ran down his spine. Somebody was rushing up the driveway behind him. He could hear footsteps scratching across the gravel, but as he whirled and an involuntary cry escaped his lips, he saw that it was only a handful of dead leaves scattered by the mischievous breeze, which now sounded so much like faint childish laughter as it raced on through the trees behind him. So much for soaking up the atmosphere, he thought, and managed to laugh softly to himself. As spooky sights go, this certainly wasn't disappointing, but he couldn't imagine anyone would be eager enough to turn it into a tourist attraction. Its history was too disturbing, its secrets too dark. If any ghost remained to haunt the site, he couldn't imagine they'd be the tame and antiquated variety found in tourist guides. He stood on the driveway at the foot of the steps leading up to the main entrance and slid his rucksack from his shoulder to rest at his feet whilst he powered up the camera. The whir of a waking flash and sharp click of a lens cover sliding back seemed amplified by the unnatural quietness of the area. How eerie it must have sounded on that night all those years ago, with the crackling of the flames, the collapse of debris, and the screams of those trapped, the ones who were still alive by then. The thought disturbed him, and as he raised his camera to his face to frame the shot of a building's smoke-seared facade, he felt defenseless against anything that might be creeping up on him. He forced himself not to look over his shoulder, though the temptation was almost unbearable, and held himself rigid whilst he fired off 3 shots from this angle. In the viewfinder, the building turned into a negative of itself every time the flash fired, and the noise sounded like a high, shrill cry somewhere distant. The building had used to look solemn and respectable before the fire. He'd seen pictures of it in old press cuttings and books whilst he'd been researching. A presentable face to cover up the fact that the staff had been abusing the children in their care. It was horrific. Really it was. Barker couldn't think of a worse thing to happen to anybody, and God alone only knew what went on in the minds of the adults who had preyed so mercilessly and coldly upon the defenceless children they were meant to be looking after. Now the building remained, eternally blackened and defeated, and much of its secrets had no doubt been covered up by the fire, though he doubted that such things could ever be cleansed. In time, some developer would no doubt acquire the property and make something new of it, and try to push the facts of its terrible past out with the rubble. How easily greed could overcome other human emotion, especially when it was only the suffering of others that one had to turn a blind eye to. Barker turned away from the front doors and began to walk alongside the blackened shell. Was that the whisper of children he heard, or just the breeze again? He stopped in his tracks, but the rushing of blood in his ears and the sound of his own breath blurred the soft noises indistinguishable. This was no place for children to play, despite the attraction of such a large and abandoned building away from prying eyes. "Hello?" he called out, thinking that if it was just the breeze whispering, then he needn't feel foolish. Something slid around the corner just up ahead, but it must only have been his own shadow amongst the many others as he began walking again, only half satisfied that there was nobody here but him. Weeds grabbed at his ankles in the darkness like the hands of mischievous children trying to trip him up. The eyes he thought were watching him around the corner of the institute seemed further away when he reached it. There had surely been the glimmer of broken glass that carpeted the gravel there. He crunched across some of it, and it must have been the gravel shifting beneath his weight that made it sound as though more people were following him, for he somehow felt more alone out here than ever before. Christ, he needed a cigarette. He fumbled in his jacket and pulled out a half-empty crumpled carton, placing one in his mouth and lighting it with shaking hands. How much atmosphere could he take? He smiled, no longer able to bring himself to laugh. What the fuck was he doing out here? It had seemed like a good idea when he'd been settled back in the warmth and familiarity of his flat, mulling over a macabre story that was nothing but words and pictures and the legends which had grown around it. But now that he was actually here, it just felt unsettling and pretty morbid. But he wasn't going to waste his journey completely by going back empty-handed. Once he was away from this place and the intense atmosphere that it still held, he would feel much better and be able to put together a decent piece from his research, his pictures, and his experience of this night. Definitely the experience. Pictures. He'd better take some more. He'd walked a quarter of a way around the building and had no more than a handful of variations of the same shot. Nothing particularly thrilling there. He stared off into the dark landscape. In the distance, beyond the clearing, trees reached with long and crooked claws to scratch at the stars. He raised his camera, framing a particularly atmospheric composition of a remote skyline, and as the flash fired, he saw children standing amongst the trees, watching him He must have been mistaken. As he lowered the camera, he saw only pitch blackness again, but his body felt coated in an icy sweat. It must have only been the twisted formations of the branches that the flash had illuminated and made to look like small immobile figures hand in hand. For why would any children in their right mind be there in complete darkness, just staring at him? He was thoroughly spooked anyway. This would certainly be a night to remember, and he'd got his money's worth from the trip here. He'd always believed that places, buildings, could retain an atmosphere over the years, some more strongly than others. Barker imagined the sheer volume of terror and suffering that the children had endured, the levels of malice and evil that the adults had inflicted. If it had been enough to drive the children to gang up and slaughter the staff before they set fire to the building and to themselves, it was certainly more than enough to leave a residue lingering unpleasantly over the decades. He looked away from the trees and started walking again, and his foot kicked at something that almost sent him sprawling. He looked down and saw a small white arm reaching out of the weeds, bloated and mottled by dampness and age. Fear held him rigid until his eyes grew accustomed to the deeper shadows, and he realized that what he'd kicked was a child's doll. He crouched and picked it up. It felt moist and swollen in his hands. One of its eyes was open, a glassy marble staring up at him, not echoing the humour of a face's flaking, painted smile. As he raised it, the other eye opened automatically, and he saw the socket was empty. The toy fascinated him in some macabre way. How long had it lain here amongst the weeds and the dirt? Who had it belonged to, however long ago? What had the little girl who lost it suffered and lived through? Had she died, wondering where her favourite toy was? Barker stuffed the doll into his rucksack and wiped his hands free of the damp and dirt on his jeans. Maybe he should have just taken a picture of the doll and left it where it was. It didn't matter. It was done now, and he turned the corner and stood in the deepest, darkest shadows at the back of the Institute. Up there on the top 2 floors had been the children's dormitories. The boys on the top floor and the girls on the middle, if he remembered rightly from the plans he'd seen of this place. Perhaps he had a copy of them amongst his files. He'd have a look tomorrow. Rows of gaping windows were a multitude of open mouths in the face of a building above him, some with teeth of broken glass, others with blackened gums of collapsed timber frame. The breeze whispered and giggled through the deserted building, and he imagined how terrible it would have been to walk through the place just after the fire, charred bodies heaped in the blackened rooms, forever night. He stepped back far enough into the mounds of rubble and broken glass and clutching weeds to take some pictures of this side of the building. Shapes stood further off amongst the weeds, but as he looked closer, he realized it was a small play area. Skeletal climbing frames and swings waited patiently for the children to return and to play. The breeze must have risen again, for as Barker fired off some shots of the playground equipment, he heard the squeaking of old rusted chains as the swings began to move, and the darkness there made him unable to reassure himself that the playground really was as empty as it should have been. The more he stared into the shadows, the more his eyes played tricks upon him, and the shadows seemed to squirm in the aftermath of a camera's flash. Somebody was running towards him from the building. He could hear their footsteps slapping on the gravel. He raised his arms defensively, his heart pounding and cold sweat coating his body. It was a child's ball bouncing along the gravel. As he watched, It stopped bouncing and began to roll towards him. His mouth felt dry and he was shaking. He tried to convince himself that the toy could have just fallen from somewhere, as surely as the old building would occasionally spit out more destroyed and loosened bits of itself when there was nobody around to notice. But the thought that there may be somebody else out here playing pranks on him was not a nice idea, and he decided that it was time to leave. Anybody who would do such things could not be in their right mind, and that wasn't the kind of company he wanted, somewhere as remote and eerie as this. The pale, white figures he glimpsed from a corner of his eye, pacing him from window to window on the upper floors of the building, could only be reflections, for nothing human would move in such a jerky and incomplete way. Beneath his quickened breathing, he could imagine that he heard conspiratorial whispers amongst the foliage, soft giggling from within the fire-gutted building. He'd never known that he had such an imagination before, and here and now was neither the time nor the place to exercise it. He just wanted to get back to his car and get the hell away from here, settle his nerves with a stiff drink at the soonest opportunity. Scaring himself witless or falling prey to whatever stupid idiot might be out here playing pranks was not going to help him sell an article. Fuck the pictures. If he didn't have enough already, he'd get some stock images from amongst his research files. There was only so many ways you could photograph a building from its 4 outside walls anyway, and if he'd ever had any notion of going inside to investigate further, then it had been replaced by a much more urgent and overwhelming desire to be seeing the miles tick by on the dashboard as he headed away from his fucking place. Something was running through the weeds up ahead. Barker quickened his pace. So maybe it was just an animal on its nocturnal forays from amongst the woods. It didn't matter. The sooner he was away from here and all the fuel it was offering his fears, the better. He realised with a humourless laugh that he had the ball in his hands. He must have picked it up behind the Institute. Like the doll, it felt soft and pulpy, like something that had lay forgotten amongst the weeds for far too long. When he heard what might have only been the breeze whispering behind him, he turned and threw the ball towards it. "Here!" he called out, his voice cracking as he tried to make light of his fear. "Have your toys back." Before he knew what he was doing, he was running away from the building and back down the driveway, driven by panic. 100 yards or so up ahead, in the impenetrable blackness, were the gates that he'd climbed, and beyond them the safety and escape that his car offered. Was it the breeze rushing by him as he ran, or the sound of things pursuing through the weeds? It didn't matter, for now that he was running, nothing was going to stop him. The distorted giggling that he heard may only have been his own. Perhaps that was why it sounded far too close for comfort. But he found himself reaching into his rucksack as he ran, dragging out the damp, swollen body of a doll and throwing it behind him like an offering of meat to pursuing hungry wolves. He'd reached the gates. As he flung himself up at them, they rattled alarmingly as though shook by dozens of tiny hands below him. Something grabbed at his leg. He kicked it off and it fell to the gravel behind him with a thud. Perhaps it was only his rucksack, for as he climbed to the top of the gates, he realised he was no longer carrying it. Whatever it was, he didn't look back, just dropped down to the track on the other side of the gates and stumbled towards the car, digging in his pockets for the keys. A pale shape lay in the shadows beside the car. He stopped, even when he heard the gates behind him rattling as though being shaken or even climbed. They were just settling after he jumped from them, that was all. And the shape beside the driver's door of his car was a sign. The sign that he'd seen when he'd pulled onto the track that led down here, and which must have been dragged here and left for him. Beware of the children. He could have laughed, and maybe he did, for he heard a high-pitched giggling over the rattling of the iron gates behind him, over the sound of things dropping down onto the track behind him. Barker thought that if the children's sphere had been intense enough to last for decades and create the atmosphere he'd felt back at the Institute, then their hatred for adults must have lasted just as long and been every bit as powerful. As he walked towards the car, he felt something tugging at his jeans, something tugging at his ankle, something tugging at his sleeve. Soft whispers overlapped, but he didn't want to look back, for if he'd thought the doll incomplete, then what would he make of the children themselves? He found the lighter in his pocket, and though the tugging at his clothes and limbs was becoming more and more insistent, he struggled onwards towards the back of a car. To block out the images of things more burned than the building had been, as blackened and charred as only flesh and bone could ever become. He pictured the car's petrol gauge in his mind. He hadn't had enough petrol to drive very far, that much was true. But he certainly had enough to give him and his new playmates one last smoke.